Well, all the matters that come before the city council, in my view, are important. It's difficult to think of anything more important, of course, than the issue of spending or budgeting. Um, uh, the last couple of years have been difficult in Eden Prairie to this extent. We've had a difficult economy, and we've had a shortage of revenue available to the city of Eden Prairie to pay for the services that the city needs. Obviously, the city needs services. We need good and responsive services to maintain the level of excellence that we've enjoyed, and that can be done. However, there are some difficult considerations when it comes to budgeting. In the last 6 years, the state has not provided any local government aid, which they previously did before. The objective of the local government aid originally was to take the pressure off the property tax owners, not only in Eden Prairie, but in other places in the state of Minnesota. That reduction in revenue in the last 6 years has been significant, and I think that reduction is close to something like 40%. The other problem we have with our budgeting is we have, because of lack of development in the city of Eden Prairie, a reduction in the amount of fees that developers pay into the city, which actually, for the most part, goes into our Parks and Recreation Fund. That has dwindled, although recently it's starting to come back. So with those revenue problems, it just means it's more difficult to raise the revenue to provide the services that we want to provide. So therefore, the only other area that we can look at is to look at our budgeting with more scrutiny, to make sure that we don't eliminate core or essential government services, but that we look to determine what services are wanted as opposed to necessary, and eliminate them from our budget. Which brings us down to this: with revenues coming to the city in effect flattening out, we also have the problem of the expenses of the city continuing to increase, primarily because of the personnel that we hire. We need good and knowledgeable people to help us run the city. The personnel that we have in the city probably is responsible for close to 70% of our budget. And the problem we're running into is that not only is there a continuing hope and demand for salary increases, but what is really creating a problem is that the obligations to provide funds for pensions and the continuing payment of rising health care costs as fringe benefits have really driven up the cost to operate the city. So what we have to do is to look for ways to reconcile these increases. For instance, some municipalities now, or some government agencies, are, because they're forced to, are actually asking their employees to pay or contribute to paying the cost of the increases of their health insurance. Also, there are some government entities that are looking at the pension plans that they have set up. And to that end, what they're really trying to do is to figure out if there is a way, without removing pensions, operating those pensions in a way that they're more, let's call it, taxpayer friendly. For instance, in many of your pensions that are set up by the government, they're set up under what's called a defined benefit plan, as opposed to a defined contribution plan. The defined benefit plan not only pays taxpayer money into that pension plan, but it in effect guarantees the investments that are made by that particular entity, such that if there's a a severe loss in the stock market, the taxpayers then have to make up the difference to supply and keep that fund fully funded. So some of the government entities are looking to change that by creating, let's call, a separate new tier. The original, let's say, is a tier 1. Well, they'll set up a tier 2, changing the contribution plan to a defined contribution, which doesn't, with taxpayer money, guarantee the fully funding of that pension plan. So to that end, it takes the taxpayers off the hook, at least to the extent that the funding or investment persons of that particular fund would be responsible for their own investments. In the private economy, we don't see a lot of these pension plans that are set up similar to what are set up in government. Rather, there's use of a lot of plans that are 401ks or those types of plans, which are not as expensive to the employers generally across the country. So we have these budgeting difficulties that we have to work through. We're doing the best we can, and we'll continue to do that. Without, I could go into that a little further, but perhaps I've covered it to this point enough so that it may have satisfied your answer. I could point out one thing on budgets, because really that's so extremely important. The League of Minnesota Cities has recently asked for and received a report from the Hubert Humphrey Institute over at the University of Minnesota, I think is where it's located. That institute is a wonderful institute. It's hardly conservative. It may be more liberal-leaning in its approach to governmental affairs, but their report indicated that from 2010 to 25, they did a projection of what they thought would be difficulties that municipalities would encounter because of revenue flow to them as opposed to costs to those municipalities. Their study, which just came out in June of this year, showed that they expected the average municipality to have a revenue increase of about, I think it was 3.7%. But they also showed that each year the municipality would encounter a 5.5 increase in costs, so that each year created a deficit or gap, so that over a period of 15 years there was going to be, unfortunately, a projected 35% gap to be made up in spending versus costs. So I take it that study at a minimum is a warning signal to municipalities that they're going to have to take a serious look at their budgeting process and try to reconcile how they're going to provide adequately for their city versus these difficulties in budgeting as a result of less income and more costs. So that's just another indicator that suggests that it's not an easy path to operate a city and make sure that it has everything it needs, but yet be able to pay for it responsibly.